Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Digging Deeper moment number 198. The purpose of our Digging Deeper moments is to take God's Word to God's world, and we're so glad that you joined us. Tonight, we begin a new series called God Speaks Our Language. One of the things that you'll notice in the Bible is that when God speaks to people, is He uses their language to communicate with them. He doesn't speak in some foreign language. Not only that, He uses what they already know to reveal what He wants them to know. This is called accommodation, and we see this throughout the Bible. And while accommodation runs through the entire Bible, we have to be careful not to allow it to cause us to oversteer when addressing a particular topic or text. Yes, understanding that God uses people's language, culture, knowledge of the world, and even their religious beliefs and scientific beliefs to some degree to communicate with them is important, but it does not mean that He's agreeing with or affirming to be true what they already know and believe. In fact, more often than not, He's correcting what they know and believe when He speaks, but He starts with what they already know. Now, we see accommodation in a number of places in the Bible. One of them is in the layout of the Temple of Jerusalem, which was based upon the layout given to Moses for the tabernacle when he was on Mount Sinai for 40 days. When Israel was brought out of Egypt, God brought them to Mount Sinai, and He gave them the Ten Commandments, but also Moses went up on top of the mountain and talked to God for 40 days. Exodus 25, 8 through 9 records, God saying to Moses, "And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them, according to all that I show you, that is, the pattern of the tabernacle and pattern of all its furnishings, just so you shall make it." Moses was to make the tabernacle and the furniture in the tabernacle according to the design, the pattern that God showed him when he was up in the mount. But did you know that the layout of the tabernacle and that thus the temple later was very similar to temples in the land of Egypt that predate Moses? These similarities have led some scholars to believe that Moses actually copied the pattern of the tabernacle that bears his name from these Egyptian temples. But this isn't the case. First of all, Exodus chapter 25, 8 and 9 tell us that God gave Moses a template for the tabernacle. He showed him a pattern. And secondly, what God is doing here is using the familiar in building designs and techniques for His sanctuary. He's actually accommodating what they already know. But there's a fundamental difference between the temples of Egypt and the temple and tabernacles of God. And it's that in the temples of Egypt, there would have been an image of the God in the Holy of Holies, which is the most inner part of that temple. But there was to be no images of God in the tabernacle of Moses or in the temple of Jerusalem. It was strictly forbidden. Instead, what you would find in the Holy of Holies was the Ark of the Covenant. You know, that's that golden box hidden by Indiana Jones in a warehouse in the movie The Raiders of the Lost Ark. The design of the temple is an accommodation. God uses what's familiar to Moses and to Israel, who had been in Egypt for 4 centuries, to communicate a new idea. And that new idea is that God doesn't dwell in temples made by humans' hands. As Acts 17:24 records, God, who made the world and everything in it, since He is the Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. That is one of the main messages of the temple and tabernacle of Israel. Therefore, studying the historical context of the buildings of the temple reveals that there are similarities between the temple of God with the temples in Egypt, but it's the difference between these that's most important and is the new information that God is giving. Another example is found in the layout of the book of Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy is the 5th book of the Bible, written by Moses after being in the desert with Israel for 40 years. Israel's about to go into the promised land, and he renews the covenant, and he writes it in the book of Deuteronomy, and it's laid out like what they call a suzerain covenant of the 2nd millennial BC. That's 2000 to 1000 BC. A suzerain covenant is a covenant between a conquering king and his vanquished subjects. And there were 6 parts to a suzerain covenant. There was the preamble or title, which identified the author of the covenant. There was the historical prologue, and that's the past relationship between the king and his vassals. Then there were the stipulations, that's the obligations laid upon the vassals or the vassal kingdom of the king. Then there's the deposition of a copy of the covenant in the vassal sanctuary and a public reading of the covenant to the people. And finally, there are curses and blessings for keeping or breaking that covenant. Now, nearly all the known treaties of the 14th and 13th centuries BC follow this pattern. It was commonplace. It was common as we have sliced bread. And the book of Deuteronomy is laid out in the same pattern. We have a preamble in chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. We have a historical prologue in chapters 1:6 through chapters 3:29. We have the stipulations the basic stipulations of chapters 4 to 11, and we have detailed stipulations of the covenant. So you don't have to get all this. I'm just showing you that's there. So the similarity between Deuteronomy and a suzerain covenant is not hard to see if you know what a suzerain covenant is. But it reveals a couple things. First, that Deuteronomy was written in the 14th or 13th century, not as some like to say. There are some theologians that want to put the writing of Deuteronomy 400 BC, 1,000 years later. But they knew nothing of suzerain covenants at that point. But in the 14th and 13th century BC, they were commonplace. So it makes sense that Moses, who was writing at that time period, would use this kind of format. This is a form of accommodation. God used a covenantal structure familiar to Israel at the time to communicate His covenant with them. And the form of the covenant is the same that was commonly used, but the content of God's covenant with Israel is unique. It's a form of accommodation. So when we're reading the Bible, we should expect God to use accommodation. That is, to speak in a person's language and their knowledge base. But we should also remember that He communicates new things. However, we need to be careful not to press accommodation too far, and we'll look at the reason why next week. If this lesson's helped you, please share it with a friend, like us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, subscribe to our YouTube channel, or check out our Sunday morning live podcast on either Apple or Spotify. And if you haven't yet subscribed to our YouTube channel, stop and do that right now. It will greatly help us. Thank you, and I hope to see you next week.